and say to Jimmy, why and when did you make the brave decision to make your life in art?
Well, believe it or not, I was actually in a totally other field of art. I was in theater. And I started doing that at LaSalle, where I was going to school. And I majored in English with a concentration in theater there. And in junior year, I took abroad in Switzerland and we did a production of Alice in Wonderland. And then that group came back and we did a show that I wrote called Babel, Play on Words. And in both cases, they were very well received. And so we stayed together after LaSalle, and it was called Imagination Theater. And it was a bit of a children's crusade, but we went back over to Switzerland and we were sleeping 8 in a room, which we nicknamed the Gulag. And we're all on mattresses on the floor. And anyway, that was also a very nice experience, but it didn't last because it was ridiculous thought. You could just, like 8 people could exist off of a theater in Switzerland. But anyway, it was a great adventure. I actually didn't study ceramics ever. I was very interested in it, and when I finished at LaSalle, I heard that there was a good program at the Germantown YWCA, and they had a very active program there with a guild and with classes. And Vicki Gold, who I think is an associate artist here, was my teacher. And she was very thorough and very good. And I went in thinking that pottery was working on the wheel. And she said, well, we'll teach you the wheel here, but we think since you're a raw beginner, you should start with hand building. And then the first thing, as often is, I pinched. And then I could pinch at home, which is like you only needed a place to put the piece down and let it rest up in between sessions and stuff. And so I kept doing that while I was learning coiling and slabs and finally the wheel. And I got to a point where I actually made a jar with a lid that fit, not that well, but it fit. And I thought, well, that's all I really need to know about that. And this contraption that was between me and the clay, just bothered me. So I said to Vicki, do I have to keep doing this? And she said, this is a hobby course. You can do whatever you want, but I wanted you to make sure that you tried everything else out first. So I just went back to pinching. And so I say, now 45 years later, I got stuck on the first lesson. So.
Well, that means you do that first lesson really well.
Yeah.
Well, so that's interesting that you started with theater, but that's also life in the arts. So I'm always interested to know, why did you even think as a kid thinking about going to college, oh yeah, I could have a career in theater, or I want to do something creative? What was it in those earlier years that drove you to that?
It was, I had high aptitude in math. My scores, like for the SATs and stuff, were slightly higher in math than in English. But by that point, I just had figured I don't want to have anything to do with science, and I don't want anything to do with business, and that leaves sort of like the arts. And as I said, I started out with in theater and studying English as my main major. And well, I mean, it was hippie times too, it was like very.
See, there you get, now we're getting to it.
It was very much into like, living on no money or very little money. And so
8 people on the mattress.
That's a good example, right? The only way to get out of there was to get a boyfriend or a girlfriend.
Who had another,
so escape from the gulag. So
got it. Do you see any connection between making pots, the way how it's evolved for you, and your ideas about theater?
Well, when I was still with the theater group, which had these transformations, and I was at a conference, and one of the workshops offered was theater and clay. So I was then, avidly pursuing it as a vocation, not an advocation, right? So I took this, his name was, the workshop provider, his name's Robert Sherman. And he had this thing which he made masks. He took a big slab, which he also taught me how to throw it like a pizza dough. And, you know, taught off long, but so I always stuck with that technique when I was working in slabs. And you put it right on your own face and you work from the outside. So it's not in any way trying to get a portrait of you. I continued to do that over, so I became a full-time potter over in Germany, in West Berlin. And it wasn't because it was a strong scene there, it was because it was a weak scene. So even somebody like myself who didn't have any credentials or much of a professional career up to then, I was able to live off of clay within 6 months, a combination of studio classes and sales. And it was, I also then started to do this performance art with making masks with this sort of movement guy, Frank, who he changed his name to something. Anyway, we would do these at like art events, and so I sort of kept some theater in the ceramics for a while. And I went back when I moved back to the States. I lived for 6 years in Berlin. I followed a woman named Jacqueline Carley over there, and she was with Group Motion. She was a dancer, and I had actually split from the theater group. The final configuration was a collective, and so everybody had equal say, and this other guy and I were paid to manage it. And we merged with the Wilma, we had merged with the Wilma project. So it was the guy, Chris Hayes, who was running that. And that, of course, became the Wilma Theater, but I can't take much credit for that. It happened after I left the country. But yeah, so I came back and I formed a comedy group with some of my old cronies. And it was called the No Respect for the Human Condition Players. And we were trying to do something along the lines of Saturday Night Live or Second City, and be specific. Like Second City was specific to Chicago and national things. So we were trying to do that with Philadelphia, and so we had skits like Philly Vice, and because it was Miami Vice was the big show at that time. And so you know, I was doing theater for a while, but then I actually, the birth of my daughter was the death knell for that. So something had to give. Out being director at the Clay Studio and doing this side, you know, gig as a comedy group. So that's the thing that had to go. That wasn't bringing money in. That's my job, you know.
Right. Well, so I also feel like there's this, okay, you started taking classes with Vicky, and then all of a sudden you moved to Germany and were making a living being an artist. So how, like, what did that transition look like?
Well, I had done the junior year abroad in Switzerland, and then the second year when we went back over initially as the theater group, I stayed on, as several of us did, and I got a job up in West Berlin at that time, and it was with the Air Force. As a high school completion, as a teacher of high school completion. And that was a very strange experience. You know, it was the Vietnam War, and I had my hair purposely long and big beard. Wanted to make sure nobody mistook me for an airman. And I was living with a Swiss communist who I think was one of the 2 or 3 who exist in the world. And so I was going back and forth, and then, you know, Berlin also is this split city, so it was really strange. So when Jacqueline said she was going to move over there because they had this experience where Group Motion performed over there, and they offered a workshop, and they thought maybe 30, 50 people would show up. 300 people showed up.
Oh my gosh.
So Jacqueline was nobody's fool, and she was like, wait a minute, I'm working as a secretary in order to dance in Philadelphia. I should move here. And she and another guy from the group, and a third guy who was sort of like a constant student who was German. They moved over there and said they were going to start with the workshops. And indeed, they got like 200. So they asked, why are 300 people here? And they said, well, there's no modern dance offered in all of West Berlin. And it's a city of, you know, of about 2 million people or something. So that's why she decided to stay there. I had just broken off with the collective, which had changed itself into Wilma, was what we called ourselves. And so I thought, well, I know German, I know Berlin. It's not that big a deal. So I followed her over there. I didn't think it was going to be 6 years, but
yeah. Well, and that's the basis of the Eastern European show, you knowing that area and getting to know people and understanding the psychology of the split city and how important it was when
yeah, well, that was one of the great experiences. I actually delayed my return to the States in order to attend a 6-week symposium where I was the only Westerner.
6-week symposium. I want to go to a 6-week symposium.
Yeah, I know that it's funny because Americans think about symposiums being a weekend or a day, but yeah, they had this tradition in East European countries. Not everybody was set up with a really sophisticated studio because, you know, it was hard to get the equipment and stuff like that. So they would have these things at factories. So this was a ceramics factory.
Okay.
So then it made like these giant kilns available to people, and, you know, and there I met people from the whole East Bloc. I had made friends with a lot of East German artists. But this was an opportunity to meet people from all over, and I realized that there was good stuff. I mean, I was very impressed with the East German stuff I was seeing, and oddly enough, I found it more comparable to the American aesthetic of ceramics, and because the West Germans were at that time, and this really changed, but at that time they were into like perfection. So they went beautiful glazes and bottle forms was like predominant, and in the East they had to be cleverer. They had to come up with other ways of doing things
because they didn't have materials.
And so and there was they didn't have anything like a ceramic shop, so they had to have these passes where they could go into ceramic factories and get clay and get materials. And so it was all, you know, it was really interesting that they, you know, were interested. I mean, the way they approached clay was much closer to the American than to the West German.
Sort of experimental and making it work. And so it sounds like the symposium that you went to in the factory was a lot like what our guest residencies are now. And in Europe, this is something that happens. You go to Spode.
It was also like summer camp for adults.
Yeah, well, it's still like that from what I hear in some places.
We partied hard and we worked hard. And I mean, the pattern was we would party till about 4 in the morning.
Okay.
And then the next night till about 2. Okay. And then the third night was crash. Everybody went to bed at 9 o'clock to recover, you know, and then it started again.
And then you did the artwork in those few wakeful hours.
Yeah, right. Well, a lot of good stuff was getting made, but, you know, I don't know how I mean, I was younger, obviously. I couldn't do this today. But yeah, it was a great opportunity. And my wife, Angela, who's in the room, who was not a participant in the symposium, but came to visit. So that was the biggest momentous biggest thing that came out of that was I met my wife.
Oh,
and
there's Angela.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. Let's look at some of your artwork, and then we can switch to sort of you know, clay studio memories, and then those Eastern European friendships and understandings really came to play when you created the momentous Eastern European ceramics exhibition. Let me share my screen. Hold on. All right. There we go. Okay. That serious photo of you. What a great photo.
Yeah, John Carlino took that. So this is stuff I made while at the Germantown Y. I mostly glazed things in those days, even though I had decided I didn't want to work on the wheel. I still thought pottery was functional for the most part, you know, and I wanted to be able to use the stuff. But then if you go to,
I know, I just realized they're not really in the right order.
Yeah, but that's one more, the one up there on the corner. Yeah. Now that Vicky told me about the sawdust fire, and I really liked it, how it looked, but also that it didn't alter the form, because they were firing cone 10 or 12 really high in the gas kiln. And my pieces would sort of warp a little bit, sink, flatten, and maybe sometimes even tilt. And so I really liked that the sawdust fire left the piece 100% the way you made it, So I was really enamored with that. But I didn't take it. I mean, I kept doing glaze things also while I was in Germany, predominantly, but more and more I was doing the sawdust firing as well.
And were you pit firing it?
Yeah, that was all pit fired. Yeah. So that's the first piece I think that I did in a sawdust fire.
Okay.
Vicky let me put a trash can on the roof of the building, and for some reason we had it like elevated on bricks, but then for some reason we took them away, and it was right on the roof, and it nearly burnt the place down. So I was not a good idea. So then I was having trouble finding places to do it, but eventually I found places that were a little safer.
Yeah,
to do it.
That's good. Okay. And this one has pattern.
Now, this is work when I moved over to, when I was living in Berlin, I got to know this guy named Thomas Wernicke, and he worked with the figure in an archaic sort of way as I was working with vessels. And we did an exhibition together that was called Archaic Pottery from the 20th century. And he did a third, I did a third, and a third was collaborative pieces. And this one, I was giving Thomas like totally burnished pieces in the raw and watching him scratch about 95% away sometimes. And I was like, why am I burnishing these pots? And he said, well, leave me a field and I'll just work in that. And, so that was how this one came about. This one, the next one is, this is quite a story. Thomas was an artist, and then he only learned his pottery making from me, and I wasn't really trained properly. Well, nothing off of Vicky, but I didn't take it formally. And so he was making stands. This is a raku piece, which I was doing at the time, and he was making stands for these pieces that couldn't otherwise stand on their own. Then he got bored with that because he didn't like to repeat things at all. So he attached, each one of those heads had a body. And he attached them, and it was impossible to pick it up without one of them falling off. And so I, repaired it several times and almost had it into the kiln, which was a front loader, and it sort of brushed against a kiln shelf, and a couple bodies fell on the floor and smashed into bits, all kinds of, and I couldn't repair it anymore. So I said, okay, that's it, off with their bodies. And we were friends with this jeweler who's internationally known named Georg Dobler.
Yeah.
And we gave it to him to make a stand for it. And I thought he would make a ring and those heads would like rest on the ring. And instead he came back with this design of a cube. And the upshot is it went on the cover of Ceramics Monthly. And I was totally out of the blue. I had sent stuff into the Ceramics Monthly, but they never got in touch with me or anything. And the next thing I know, we had a subscription to Ceramics Monthly, but it was under Imka, my partner's name. And so I get a Ceramics Monthly addressed to me, and I'm like, what's this about? And then I pull it open and this is on the cover, but there was no story or anything to accompany it, just the cover. They did that in those days, I guess.
Yeah.
And this is my solo show at the Clay Studio. It was 90, so we moved in 90, and this was about 95. And I was continuing to make pots on my own, but rarely finishing them. Whenever I had a chance, I just pinched. It was my therapy in a way at home. And so I had a room full of pots, and I also I was like, I can't burnish these. I'll be stupid if I spend that much time. So for the most, there were some burnished ones, but then I started using terra sigillata. And then the two larger ones there, I started spraying the raw pieces with terra sigillata, but then they started cracking because they had gotten so dry.
Yeah.
And So I thought, okay, I thought I had heard about people putting terza gelato on bisqueware. And I did that. I re-bisqued it. And I thought, okay, I'm home free. But then I went to open up the kiln, which was about 2 weeks before showtime. And the terza gelato had peeled off
Oh,
for the most part, but it left these beautiful trails.
yeah.
And on the one on the right that has a little more purple on it, that's the original, that's the terracid that didn't peel off.
Mhm.
And then the one over there on the left is almost all of the sidge peeled off and left these beautiful trails.
Mm.
So I started doing that on purpose,
Ah,
and it's kind of still something I do today.
yeah, experiments.
And this is one of the ones that cracked when I sprayed it with the terracid. And so this is another thing that's sort of an example of one of my sayings that I say in my teaching and workshops, and it's embrace breakage.
Embrace.
So I had heard of Rick Dillingham, who did this sort of on purpose, and he would break a bisque piece and he would fire it in different techniques, but all the same temperature,
Oh,
and then he'd put them back together. So basically, that's what I did here. That piece of copper there was to that's where a chunk broke out earlier,
oh, it's
and
copper.
I had somebody make that for me. And then I fired the pieces, the shards in different places and different little bit differences in treatment, and then attach them all back together again. And I still do that too. And I mean, when you pinch large and you it's so fragile,
Yeah,
you're going to get
you
breakage.
have to
So you better
expect it.
learn to embrace it, you know.
Right. That's good. Well, I mean, that one and then these others, and that idea that they sort of went through these unintentional yet beautiful metamorphosis, that's kind of what I had in my mind when I asked if you thought of your pottery reflecting theater, because they're very dramatic.
Oh,
They're very, they're not quiet, really. I don't know. I feel like they have this sort of showmanship, or they're telling a story, I guess.
yeah. Well, this one, you can see across the bottom there, that looks like Italy. So this is a
It
very
does look like a
dramatic
map.
pot, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, and go to the next one. That's the one that has the super trails.
Oh, so
So
that's just from it cracking off.
yeah,
It's like a brain slice or something.
there's the technique naked raku, which people do, but that tends to really pretty much look the same each time. I see it. This, you get something different each and every time.
Oh,
So
that's great.
and I haven't been able to I have to start re-bisquing the pieces, because I've sort of just gone right to like putting the terracid on, letting it dry, and putting it into the sawdust fire, because I've gotten lazy. But it doesn't have as good effect, so I have to get back to
Go back to that. Well, the other two, I'm just gonna go back to these. This is a more recent one, I think.
This is a recent one. This is about 2 or 3 years old. And then the next piece is I have a show up now in the window of Gravers Lane Gallery in Chestnut Hill.
Yeah.
And that's where Bruce Hoffman, who used to manage the Works Gallery, he's managing that now. And Barbara Botting, who was a fellowship artist here, works there as well. And she really liked these embedded shard pieces that I started doing.
This is really great.
I guess about 15 years ago, I was collecting shards in the Wissahickon woods when I walked my dog there.
Oh.
And I started I said 15, it was about 20, 25 years ago now that I think about it. But anyway, she was really taken with that body of work. So it was good for me to get back to it, and I've enjoyed it. And this is one of the ones that's on display there now.
Yeah, it's particularly, I don't know, it's wonderful. And the idea that, are all of the shards from things you collected? Or did you end up with going to, you could go to a thrift store and find something?
Well, yeah, I used to have this thing about it had to have been found. I didn't want to be breaking things to make things. But I've since come around on that, but these were all found.
Yeah, I mean, the pedestal base is so great.
Yeah, and but I have boxes and boxes of shards in my basement where I
All from
work.
the Wissahickon?
No, some are given to me by others and stuff, but yeah, a lot of them from the Wissahickon.
Oh, that's so
See, the
great.
Wissahickon was much more densely populated at one time.
Yeah, there was a
So,
lot of industry along the stream.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
paper mill.
And people lived, which is in now what's woods. But so it was before trash collections, so they burned what they could and threw things like shards into a heap or the privy.
Right.
And so they would just wash up after a rainstorm. And then also there were bottle hunters who would dig pits where, and then they didn't care about broken things. So they just threw them around. So I could find, 100 shards in the same area of where they dug. So yeah, there was a lot of shards. The first show I did with that was at the airport, at one of the airport displays, and it was called Shards of the Wissahickon. And that in a way would be a little bit more related to theater. I made up the collector, and I had diary pages of what he was thinking when he found these shards. And I had, besides the pieces that were embedded with shards, I had little collections and everything. I borrowed this from the Wagner Institute.
Yeah.
And I guess you've seen it.
The Wagner?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Well,
great.
they have all their signs are handwritten and really funny. I mean, like there'd be a row of minerals and then these arrows pointing to it from handwritten descriptions. And so I had these little, I tried to sort of mimic that in a way with little collections of shards.
Yeah.
And everything was handwritten.
That's wonderful. I mean, if anyone hasn't been to the Wagner, it's amazing. It's near Temple's main campus, and it hasn't been reinstalled since 1898 intentionally, so that it's not only a record of the objects that they have there, but it's also a record of the way scientists and people wanted to classify and display. So you were doing homage to that.
Do you have any pictures of the show I did with Angela that would have had embedded shards from me?
I don't have those.
Well, we did a show. We were doing several installations in Germany. Angela had gotten a grant to do installations in abandoned churches. And so that sort of culminated. So she wrote me into working with her and lied and said, I said, I don't want to do it. I mean, I'm not going to put a pot in the middle of a room and say it's an installation. So but she snookered me. She said, I'll have everything ready. You just bring the pots and you just put them on these stands. That's all you have to do. And so I got there and she had done nothing. And the church was, well, she had these stands made, but they were really thin. No.
Well,
there's more.
Anyway,
yeah,
it's more. This story is more.
Anyway. It was fun to figure out. The church still had a dirt floor and nothing could stand. These skinny stands she had made with glass tops of all things weren't stable, and we broke 2 tops before. I said, we got to figure a way to. So we took one of these beams that was also just hanging around, and we just nailed them to that. And coming up with those solutions and stuff really got me involved with the whole idea of doing installations. So the final thing we did together in that way was at this museum, at this castle that was also a history museum.
Oh, okay.
So they let us go into their stacks and pick out things, and then we made our sort of, not try to replicate them, but use them as inspiration to make pieces. And then again, borrowing from the Wagner, they had these really old vitrines that they weren't using anymore, and they were wooden framed in glass. So we put them in there and tried to make. We purposely used a room next to the historic collection, and they had a place, a contemporary gallery in the castle, but that's not what we wanted to do. So we wanted people to like wander into this room, and we showed them together with the pieces that inspired the work. And so anyway, the whole idea was to like get people thinking this is part of the historic collection, and then go, yeah, there's something wrong here.
Well, that does sound like the theater connection.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, that's wonderful. I know that people are interested to hear about your time at the Clay Studio and how that started, and then the move to that building and the Eastern European and your idea for starting the collection, and all of these things are.
Well, the place I started at was 49 North 2nd Street, which was actually, I guess, the third location.
Right after
they were
fire.
Briefly in one, then burned it down within 6 months. So,
I heard it was not the kiln that set the building on fire. But anyway, we won't talk about that on camera.
I don't know if the statute of limitations has run out. So,
well, let's just pass that by.
What's that?
We'll just pass by.
Yeah.
Go ahead. So you're
anyway,
the third location.
They decided about 3 years before I took the job that they were going to have an executive director. It was just an artist collective, and they had incorporated, but the artists themselves were the board,
right?
Which you could do. You still can do that. And anyway, they decided they needed to, there was with the fire, they opened up the board to be more community members and people who could help financially and things like that. So I started there, and at first I was executive director of myself. The only Matt Courtney was it Matt? I guess was working as the tech, and so he was like the only other person working there. But he operated fairly independently, and that's how small the whole thing was, and it had a lot of the collective nature of the place. It was how it was done. So I, had to just basically do it that way. I mean, the artists picked their own, like anybody coming in as a member, they chose it amongst themselves and, other things. So it wasn't basically you were just expected to raise money, but also, I guess in a way, I mean, there was the gallery committee booked the shows, but somebody had to mount them and hang them. And, so, I mean, I was doing curatorial things as well, but it was not a big operation. And then we got notice that we had to be out in 3 months. They were going to, the building had gotten sold.
Oh my God.
And there was this agreement in the lease that said we could buy it if we would have right of first refusal. But there was this dramatic meeting where the board met and they couldn't come up with or they weren't willing to come up with the money to, and if you can think about this now, they could have bought that building for $120,000. And I don't think you can get an apartment in Old City for $120,000.
No.
So it's a shame they didn't. And well, no, it's not the shame because we signed. They didn't sell. The people who bought it were just trying to flip it. And it was the real estate agent who handled our rent. It was he and a bunch of his cronies. They saw, a bargain when they saw it. And so it was like right then was when the real estate bust hit. And they couldn't sell the building.
Okay.
So their all hopes of selling the building fell down, and they renegotiated with us and gave us like a 2-year lease. At a much higher rate than
this
we were
was
paying.
still at 49.
At 49.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was like I immediately looked around for other alternatives. There was a guy down there. He was owner of National Restaurant Equipment, and he also owned about a third of Old City. He had bought all these things for a song, and his idea was. He wanted long-term, he wanted to have no responsibility or as little responsibility for these buildings as possible. He wanted long-term renters. And so he was willing to do the 30-year lease that we had. And so we're talking now moving up into the, what was the number there? 137 and 30, 37, 39.
Yeah.
So it was this huge building. So when we moved in there, we tripled our space, but we also moved in, the Pew said that they would be supportive of it. At that time, they were still doing capital funding, but it needed to be larger than just one organization. So we teamed with Nexus, who at that time was pretty much the premier arts collective in Philly. And so then we rented 2 floors to them, and they decided they didn't need the second floor just yet. And they sublet to another artist collective called Highwire. The second floor of our building, we wanted for ourselves, but we couldn't rent it. We started to run out of money, so we couldn't do all the things we wanted to do. So we sublet that to another group called Zone 1. So there was then 4 arts organizations in the building, and it was called Second Street Art Building. And as I was saying, earlier with my moment of joy, it was amazing, just by, the fact that we had put entries and doors so you can go through all the building without having to go back out in the street.
Oh, you put in all those doors between
the spaces, yeah. And so we started coordinating our openings, of course. And the Clay Studio had been doing openings on Sunday afternoon, but they were no great shakes. I mean, if 5 people showed up, I was happy. If one of the resident artists had a show, then of course it was, much better visited. And then, let's see, let's keep on track here. So that basically, that was how First Friday came about.
Yeah.
Because we moved it to Fridays. Nexus was on a 4-week schedule, so it wasn't always the first Friday of the month. But then a lot of other galleries were opening up in the area, and then these other people said, well, let's formalize this and let's do it every month on the same day. I mean, the same first Friday, and that's how First Fridays got started.
And they just had the 35th anniversary of First Friday this year, I think.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, and that was so important to the whole city.
Oh yeah,
the whole city does it now. I mean, we
it
do
was
second Thursday.
Yeah, it was, and it was like immediately a runaway train. It was just like I would think, well, you were still at the old building. I mean, the most recent building before this one, and I don't know how many people were coming in, but if we would have about 1,000 or 2,000 people a night of First Friday.
Yeah, it started to change a bit, but we still, when I was first in 2015-16, we still had 700 people or something coming through, and then COVID happened and changed. So now we have to convince people, everyone comes visit us on second Thursday. That's what happens in this neighborhood, second Thursday. Right? We're gonna make Raven made a logo and everything to remind people.
So so that's, that was all very successful.
Yeah.
And then when we moved into the building, I had already had the idea of, so we moved in '89. So things had started changing that were well along the way.
When you
East Europe separating from Russia.
Yeah.
And
wait, I have one more technical question just because I'm curious. When you first moved in and you were just on the first floor, but I guess you have the basement too.
Yeah.
Were the artist studios all on both sides, or I know
on the third and fourth floors were the artist studios.
No, but I mean when you were sharing it with everybody else.
Yeah, the third and fourth floors were all ours, both sides. So
you had 3 and 4. You didn't take the first floor for yourself?
No, the first floor, then there was Zone 1, then the school floor, and then the
so the residents had always been on the 4th floor.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And where was the gallery? On the 3rd floor?
On the first floor.
On the 3rd.
And then when we reclaimed the space from Zone 1, we had a second floor gallery.
Yeah, I remember the second. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Well, anyway, I had this idea to do the East European show basically when we moved in. So I told all the other subletters that at a certain time, we were going to need their spaces. They'd get plenty of notice and they wouldn't have to pay rent those months. And so everybody knew that sort of going into it.
Oh, okay.
And then that was the good thing about that building, that it was sort of flexible that way. because the East European show was the biggest and the most successful, but we went on to do the Puerto Rican show and the Israel show, which it pains me, but it was close to being a combined Israeli-Palestinian show, because it was right in that year after Arafat and Begin had shook hands, and everybody thought there was going to be peace. And of course, that never happened. But so anyway, we did those shows, and we would borrow back what we needed. Well, we got the second floor from after. We initially thought they'd be in there for 5 years, but I guess after 7, we finally said, we want that space back.
Yeah.
And but at that point, we had gotten the rights to the building next door. So we started subletting that out, and that's where Zone 1 moved to. But that wasn't all that successful for them. But anyway, we had the second floor back, so we could do a combined first floor, second floor show, or we could borrow Nexus and and the 2 stories. So we would put together different combinations to do the different larger shows.
Got it. So Eastern European was the biggest one, and you had it on the first and second floor.
Yeah.
And talk about how you went through.
No, it was in all 4 spaces, all 4 galleries.
Oh.
So the whole first and whole
second. Okay. So you invited people to come here to be guest artists.
Yeah, that was another thought. I'd seen
For Eastern European. Was the first time that happened?
pretty much so. Actually, the very first person was Paulus Berenson, who was my mentor, and later we became friends. But in large, what happened was he thought he had cancer. And even though it turned out to be something else, he was very ill, and he was teaching workshops all over the place and supporting himself that way. And of course, he had his book, Finding One's Way with Clay, which is how I learned a lot of the things I do with pinching. And it's a great book. If anybody, wants a copy, get in touch with me. I have a source because there was a reprinting of it. But in any way, so I heard that he had done a workshop at what was Studio Potter, which wasn't really an arts. It was just Jerry Williams's private studio. And I heard that they had a workshop with Paulus Berenson, and 28 people were there. And so I called up Jerry, who I knew, and I said, "Is this true? Is Paulus Berenson back out on the circuit?" And he says, "Yeah." And he gave me his number, and I called him up, and next place he went was us. So he did back-to-back weekends. He drew people to his workshops like crazy.
Yeah.
And so he did 2 separate ones back, and then the week in between, he used the guest artist studio, which we had just installed basically. So he was the very first.
He was the first.
But that was about the year. That was the year before the East European show.
Okay.
And so mostly we had a lot of the artists from Eastern Europe. We had a little symposium of about 2 weeks as well, which a whole bunch of them came. And, in those days, we didn't have any place to put the artists, but a lot of people volunteered to house artists. So.
And they made the work for the show when they got here.
No,
they didn't. Okay. They shipped it.
It was all shipped.
Got it.
Actually, in '91, I went to Europe and curated the show, and it was 75 artists in the show, and I couldn't get to see them all, but it was I visited 45 artists, and there was a movie called "If This Is Tuesday, It Might Be Belgium." And in this case, it was "If This Is Tuesday, it might be Latvia or Lithuania, or something like that.
Oh my gosh, 75.
So 40. Oh, and this was 30 days. I had to do that, so I visited 45 artists in 30 days. So.
And this was also Pew gave funds for the move. Then they gave funds for this show.
Yeah.
Which wasn't called Pew then. Or yes, it was.
Yes, it was. It had just become Pew about 5 years before that. It had been. It had all the Pew children all had their own foundations going.
Yeah.
And they were usually very specific, like just to support one place or this or that. And then I guess the government made this regulation that you couldn't have your assets over a certain percentage in one place, so
Oh,
that,
yeah. Mhm.
this was Standard Oil money,
Right.
which is Sunoco.
Mhm.
And so they, when they combined all these like
Baby
little
foundation.
foundations, they
Yeah.
became massive overnight, as well as that turned out to be very lucrative, selling the Sun Oil, their abundance of Sun Oil stock,
Uh-huh.
like made a lot of money.
Yeah.
I don't know what the circumstances were exactly, but they leapt up to like number 4 in the country
Mm.
within a very short period of time.
Well, they're still very friendly to us, so we love them.
Yeah,
So
well,
I should
it's
know
good
that they've always been important to her.
yeah, I mean, what they became integral to the arts in Philadelphia, and
Yeah.
the William Penn Foundation, of course, was
Also
also. So those were
Continues
the
to
two
be very
major,
supportive.
yeah, those were the two major supporters of the renovations.
Yeah. We really we've run out of time, even though I feel like we haven't even dug into the Eastern European. So I want people to have a chance to ask questions. So
What is it, Tom?
it's 1:58 already.
Oh, my goodness.
I know, I told you it goes fast. Leslie Barron's talking about Paulus Barron's and then his cult following. Yeah, that's true. I know people are excited about that. Well, I'm gonna say people put your questions in the chat and then we'll hear a little bit more about Eastern European, but feed your questions in there and then I'll ask people in the room too, while we talk for a few more minutes.
Okay.
So I don't know, once you had the show open, I hear so many people talk about how important that show was to them as a visitor. So I guess I would like to hear from your perspective. What was,
Well, it was a
changed
success.
Yeah.
I mean, it was 92, so it was very timely, Eastern Europe had just opened up.
Mhm.
And we hit a certain zeitgeist, that just it was the right place at the right time. And
What do you think it was about the work that really spoke to people here in Philadelphia?
well, I think when I said before about the East German aesthetic,
Mhm.
I think that was pretty much the case throughout Eastern Europe.
Raymond's
And-
bringing you something to look at.
And oh, these are Paulus, yeah.
Yeah, they're part of the collection.
They're- Paulus, and he made these in that residency, yeah. So anyway, Paulus and I became good friends, and we even co-taught. He kept threatening to retire. And being a fervent disciple, I was like, Paulus, what about if we, co-taught, and I'll deal with all the shit and you just do your poetry.
Mhm.
And that's how we did it. And he was very disconcerted the first time. We taught it out, it was at Touchstone out in Western Pennsylvania. And but then we did it successive times, and then Angela had the idea she wanted to see Paulus in Germany, so we did workshops in Germany, three different workshops and each time, and it was West Germany, and then Angela, being from East Germany, said, you should really see the East too, it's quite different. And so we went back the next year and did 3 workshops in East Germany.
Mm.
So that was really great. It was nice to become, even better friends with him. And he could be a little demanding, shall we say, but anyway, he was a lovely man. And he had me down to Penland a couple of times. I was a guest artist at one of his workshops, and down there they do 3-week sessions. And so that was nice. But then the next time we actually co-taught it.
Mhm. That's great. Okay, so this is sort of our wrap up, this back to this question of what do you think it was about that show that really spoke to people here in Philadelphia so strongly?
Well, it was not just Philadelphia. I mean, it was
it
literally
traveled.
written up. It was traveled,
Yeah.
and it was written up in all the major ceramic magazines.
Mhm.
So it was like, it just, again, it was, the Eastern Europe had just
You
opened
hadn't
up,
seen
and
it.
it was, everybody wanted to see. And it was the first, in a way. There was a project, in fact, that allowed me to pick out some of the, it was a project with the former Soviet artists.
Mhm.
And they brought over a bunch of people and put them around the country, and then all the work was concurrent with Flagstaff, brought to Flagstaff, which was concurrent with an NCECA conference
Oh,
in
okay.
Tempe. And so I got up there, and I mean, a very important meeting there was with Petros Martinson, who was from Latvia. And he basically, without him, we wouldn't have had the Soviets, the ex-Soviets. He had everybody bring their work personally to Riga, the capital of Latvia. He got the Latvian artists organization to say it was a Latvian show, so it could get exported. We sent a firm from Finland down to pack the show and take it back to Helsinki, and then pack it for international transport.
Yeah.
And so when I got the wire, the news that it's in Helsinki, it was like, we got it out, we got it out. So it was that was, I mean, it was just a lot of incredible things happening. And then it was during the NCECA conference in '92 that we had the show,
right? Of course,
which was, of course, by design.
Sure.
And it was like I had people coming up to me and saying, I've been here 5 times. I mean, other people said, I haven't seen anything, I haven't done anything at the conference. I've just been here every day, and all this stuff. Yeah. So it was really, it was just magical time.
Wonderful. Well, we're excited to have the echoes of that show in the collection. So that's something we was started partially because of that show and the work that you kept here, and then the ongoing guest artist program.
Yeah, I didn't really think about it starting the collection right away. In fact, I was trying so desperately to get the what's the museum in Syracuse that specializes? Everson, yeah. I was trying to get the Everson to be like the last stop on the tour, and then I was, because I didn't have enough money for return shipping.
Yeah.
So it was like when I told people, I said, "This is a one-way trip here. Your stuff's coming over; it's not coming back."
Yeah.
So, but then I couldn't get the Everson to do it, and the director was driving me crazy, and the real audacity of the thing is that it got booked by this, touring agency we were working with at Auburn, which is a suburb of Syracuse, at a dinky little art center. And the critic up there said, why wasn't this at the Everson? And he called me up and said, why wasn't it at the Everson? And I was like, if hands could travel through phone lines, they'd be around your neck right now. I mean, I'm telling him, book this show, and because I saw from their collection, they had a lot of stuff from international shows that had been there, and I figured that would be the great place for this stuff. Since it didn't happen, it was like, well, what do we do with this stuff? And then it was like, well, I guess we should collect. So it all came out of that. Yeah.
Well, and here it is, finally on display.
Yeah, well, and then I see a lot of shows. This is a Puerto Rican piece up here, and
no, that's not the right thing.
in there. There it is. Yeah, that this is, and so from the other major shows we did, we asked people if they wanted to, leave them for the collection. Then a component of the the artist in residence program was that you had to leave a piece. But then many people, left all their pieces. So we sold what we could.
Yeah, and they were still
it was getting crowded. That's when we had to rent out extra storage space. This was, and of course, it never, it was, we would show shows selected out of the collection, but it was not, mostly things were not seeing the light of day, and so.
Well, we're excited that now every piece is out on display for people to see and be inspired by. So thank you for starting that. Thank you for everything that you did. The Eastern European show and all your work has helped us get where we are now.
Well, you certainly did a nice job at that.
We have a good team.
I mean, we, as I say, we tripled when we moved from the one place to the other, and I guess you tripled again when you moved here. I don't know. What would you be? What would you say? Well, was it about 3 times as big? Yeah.
We had,
and then it's amazing how quickly it fills, isn't it?
we've doubled our number of students almost. Still sold out, still with waiting lists.
Yeah.
So Well, thank you, everyone. Oh, we do have some questions. Leslie said, in retrospect, that show had an important legacy for the artists involved. I'm still in awe that Jimmy made it happen. JM says happy birthday. And Sandy asked, how did you attach the shard?
Oh, okay. So yeah, I even use glass shards sometimes, and people were like, how do you do this? And because they presumed that shards were going through the firings, but they weren't. they what I do is I press it in as I'm forming the piece, and then I remove it, and then guesstimate 10% shrinkage, so then I enlarge it as a guesstimate of 10%. If I don't get that quite right, I may have to take a Dremel and grind out a corner or two to refit the shard.
So you do it after.
That smells like a dentist. It makes me feel like, and the sound is like a dentist. And so you don't do that in the same room when anybody else is around.
Okay.
And anyway, then they're reattached with a two-part epoxy that was developed by Graham Marks, who was Rudy Staffel's son-in-law. He was married to Rudy Staffel's daughter, and he developed this stuff, and he was promoting it at an Sika, and I thought, that's what I need, because it was more malleable, and it stayed malleable much longer than like a plumber epoxy or something like that. And so you could really get in there, attach the shard, and you could grind it away with the Dremel, and then I could blacken it with the Dremel by putting a carbon steel top on it. And so, I could make them look like they were there the whole time, but they weren't. They were all windows.
That's great.
In fact, when I have a piece that has a lot of shards, it's like you wouldn't recognize it,
when it came out of the kiln. Well, that's great. I love those pieces. We'll see more of those, hopefully. Okay, well, I asked people to leave their birthday wishes in the chat, because then I can print them out for you and send them along.
That'd be very nice.
But I'll just put it back on the gallery so we can see everyone's face. If you want to turn your camera on, so we can say happy birthday to Jimmy one more time. So sorry that you guys don't get our
it was the big
cupcake.
7-0.
7-0. You can.
This is scary. I never thought I'd live that long.
Take yourself off mute, and then we'll all say happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Jimmy.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Jimmy.
Oh, now you're
Birthday.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Happy
Thank you.
birthday, Jimmy.
Thanks for a great hour. Thank you.
Thanks
Yeah.
for joining us.
Very much.
Take care.
Time flies when I'm talking. For me.
It does.
Need a part 2.
Mhm.
All right,
Right.
part 2. We'll schedule part 2.